everyone. Welcome to Inquire Live at Gameday Central alongside EJ Smith. I am Olivia Reiner. We are coming at you live from M&T Bank Stadium, gearing up for the Eagles preseason opener against the Baltimore Ravens. EJ, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Olivia. It's been a while. I feel like we got to, knock the cobwebs off a little bit. But, I can't tell you, I'm very excited to see some football tonight, first and foremost. But even more so, I'm really excited to be on the show again. It's like, I feel like all off season, I just kind of, I got just missing something, and I feel like the show is going to fill that void. So very excited to be here tonight. Excited to talk Eagles Ravens with you.
Well, I'm glad we can serve both a purpose for our audience and also for you, EJ. I missed doing all this with you too. It's been 207 days since the last Eagles game, so it's been a while. Who's counting? I'm counting. I'm excited to get started again, and hopefully you're all excited to follow along with our coverage all season long. Make sure you're heading over to inquire.com/Eagles Gameday to check out all of our coverage throughout the season. Be a part of our conversation today throughout the game. If you have a question or a comment or a thought during today's show, please leave it down in the chat, whether you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook. We want to hear from you. We want to be here for you and answer some of your questions, and we look forward to incorporating you in our show today. EJ, let's get right into it. We have a lot to discuss. We do not get inactives for the preseason. However, that said, our colleague Jeff McLean here of the Inquirer reported earlier today that the starters are expected to play in today's game against the Ravens for at least a series. So we don't know exactly if that's every single one of the starters, if that is most of the starters, if that's select starters. We'll find out very soon. But let's think back to the last time we saw the offensive starters in particular. Jalen Hurts got some playing time for a series against the New York Jets back in 2022. And fans may remember how that didn't end, but, kind of close to the end of that series. He took a late hit out of bounds and certainly gave a lot of people a scare. When you think about the benefit of playing in the preseason versus some of the risks, how do you go about weighing those things?
Yeah, I certainly remember that hit that Jalen Hurts took on the sideline and the ensuing outrage from Nick Sirianni screaming to Robert Saleh across from his sideline to the Jets sideline. So, there's definitely a risk factor involved here with playing the starters. I've had people on Twitter asking me about the conditions here. Obviously, it was kind of a rainy drive down here. I'd say it's been a little bit more dry since we've arrived, the last hour and a half or so. They took the tarp off the field. We're kind of far from the field, so I can't tell you for a fact whether or not the field is dry or not. But I can tell you that, from here it looks reasonably dry, is what I would call it. There's not puddles everywhere. There's not footprints on the field as guys are running around. So, especially with the way the field is, I think, it was going to be interesting to see what they decided to do, with the injury risk. And to your point, they have played Jalen Hurts a series or two multiple times in his career. Last year, he did not play. The starters really didn't get much action last year in the preseason. There is definitely a risk reward factor. I think it's hard to really, put an intrinsic value on preseason reps for these guys. I think what you can look at is their week one results. Now, the Eagles have gotten off to really fast starts the last few years with Nick Sirianni as the head coach. And I think that kind of does, sort of pour cold water on the notion that these guys need to play a quarter or a half in the preseason. But if you look at their week one results, I do think there's been a little bit of a preseason vibe in some of those games. Last year they beat the New England Patriots 25-20, a game against a not so great Patriots team, and the Patriots kind of hung around in that game. Sort of had a malaise. I remember the weather wasn't great that day either, which maybe contributed to it. The year before, they beat the Lions 38-35. A.J. Brown had a really amazing day in his Eagles debut. But again, the Lions kind of mounted a comeback, sort of hung around a little bit longer than you would have expected them to. The year before, they blew up the Atlanta Falcons in Nick Sirianni's first year. So that one, although that was probably the year we saw the starters the most in the preseason. So, after the Patriots game last year, Nick Sirianni did say that they might revisit their approach to training camp in the preseason because of the way that they've kind of stumbled out of the blocks. Again, it's hard to say they stumbled out of the blocks when they won the games, but I do think that when you don't play your starters in the preseason, that week one game kind of does take on a different type of personality, a little bit more unpredictable, maybe a little bit closer than the Eagles would have liked. I think especially when you consider they're going to be in Brazil, it's going to be a big travel week, and it's a good opponent. The Green Bay Packers look like they could really make some noise this year. I do think it makes sense to get the starters a little bit of time, in the preseason.
We heard kind of differing opinions from some of the players this week. Jalen Hurts made it seem like it wasn't necessarily so important for him to get some of these preseason reps. Whereas then we heard from guys like Josh Sweat, Brandon Graham, who are like, yeah, we kind of would like to get our feet wet. It helps getting acclimated to the speed of the game again, especially when you're working with a new defensive coordinator. Brandon Graham specifically kind of predicted that old school Vic Fangio would want to try to get back to the old ways of getting the starters some reps in the preseason. And he figured that they would get some of the starters out there, and we will see officially in about 90 minutes. However, that seems like it is going to be the case, at least for a series. So while we don't have inactives, we do know players who are likely not going to be playing in today's game due to injury. Two notable players are CJ Gardner-Johnson, who's been dealing with a shoulder injury, and he's been sidelined from practice in the recent days. And then also wide receiver Paris Campbell has been dealing with a groin injury for the majority of training camp and has kept him sidelined and really out of this third wide receiver spot competition. And if those players who were kind of, I guess you could say they were maybe not so much in Campbell's case, but particularly in Gardner Johnson's case, a presumed starter, who is going to get the most opportunities in their place in today's game?
Well, we'll start with CJ Gardner-Johnson. I would say like Cooper DeJean being sidelined, it's a real shame tonight because I feel like it would have been a good excuse to say, oh, let's see the rookie play a little bit from the safety, a little bit from the slot. I think you'll see Avonte Maddox, another player with some versatility in that role. I know he was in there during the last practice. You've also seen James Bradbury getting more reps with the first team with CJ Gardner-Johnson sideline. I think we're going to see a good amount of Bradbury tonight. I think at least in the first half, you could see him, occupying that new safety spot. I think the Eagles probably want to see what he looks like in that role. I don't want to give away too much. I know we're going to talk about Bradbury later in the show, but I do think you might see him in the wide receiver 3 competition. There's a lot of guys, obviously, John Ross. I'm really excited to see Johnny Wilson in his NFL debut, though. I mean, I should mention Britton Covey as another one who can kind of fill that wide receiver 3 void. But I think the Eagles are going to want to see Johnny Wilson, in extended time today. I think Eagles fans are going to want to see him. I know, I've obviously written about him. I know that there's a lot of intrigue about him as just a big receiver who can move pretty well for that size. So I think you're going to see all those guys kind of getting reps in Paris Campbell's place. But I think Johnny Wilson probably is leading the pack among those guys. He has gotten a lot of first team reps since Campbell was sidelined. And I think he's done really well with that opportunity. He's flashed some potential for sure.
Soon enough, about 90 minutes from now, we'll see exactly who is going to be suiting up for the Eagles and who gets some meaningful snaps. You already mentioned, EJ, the fact that it has been raining throughout the day. Right now, it does not appear to be actively raining. However, from 6 to 8 p.m. in the forecast, it is already 6:08 p.m., but it is supposed to start to pick up a little bit with partly cloudy conditions expected at 8 p.m. How could the weather potentially impact this game, whether it's from a personnel standpoint or even just a game plan standpoint?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I remember Kellen Moore talking about the importance of getting the process down going into the regular season. I think that's part of why we're seeing the starters, not to go back to the starter point, but, I think that's part of the reason we're seeing those guys getting some time or, expected to get some time. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's pouring rain and they send the starters out there, it wouldn't surprise me if you see Jalen Hurts hand the ball off 3 times and then everybody says, all right, get the heck out of there. I do think, just the experience of calling plays in the huddle, hearing Kellen Moore's voice in the headset, getting that operation down cleanly without putting Jalen Hurts in harm's way would still make some sense, especially if the conditions are the way they might be. If there is any risk involved with that. So I do think you might see more of a run-heavy approach with the starters in the early part of the game if the conditions call for it. And then beyond that, I honestly don't think it'll affect it too much. I think the Eagles are going to want to get quality tape on guys in position battles, guys in roster battles, guys who are fighting for roster spots. So I think it's certainly going to be a factor in how the game is played, but I don't know if it'll affect the way the game is called, if that makes sense. I think they're still going to want to see, these guys really get quality reps and quality tape. I'm really excited if it is going to rain to see how it impacts the kickoff. We've heard about this new rule where if it's windy, you can have a holder for the kickoff, but he has to run off the field in a reasonably timed manner. Otherwise, it's a penalty. So I do think, just seeing some of the wrinkles of the new kickoff might be interesting in this weather. I know that's a pretty football sicko take with me to be sitting here telling you about how excited I am to see the new kickoff and if the conditions affect it. So but still, I am excited to see it. I think it'll be interesting. So.
EJ, a football sicko, I never would have expected that. Before we move on here, we've talked about all of these players that we think are going to get reps in tonight's game. I think someone who is definitely going to get reps, substantial reps throughout the preseason, is Kenny Pickett, who is projected to be the backup quarterback for the 2024 season. Michael Jester over on YouTube right now is asking if we have any idea how much Kenny Pickett will play tonight. I don't think we have an exact number of snaps in our mind, but I would imagine, EJ, that he's going to get quite a substantial look, especially if Jalen Hurts is only playing for a series.
Yeah, I could see it being like Kenny Pickett's second quarter, and then Tanner McKee for most of the third quarter, and maybe into the fourth quarter, and then Will Grier gets some snaps toward the end of the game. Hurts being a factor there does kind of change things. The second and third preseason game, if the starters aren't playing, I could see it being Pickett's first half, McKee's third quarter, Will Grier at the end of the fourth quarter type of situation. So I think Pickett will be the first one up. I know there's been a lot of intrigue about the backup quarterback spot. I think Pickett will get the lion's share of those reps with the second team offense. And then, I think he'll turn it over to Tanner McKee for probably even, again, probably most of the second half. I think we'll see Will Grier, but that's kind of the one that I'm probably less certain of. Maybe they really want to see McKee and Pickett in this game, and then they'll get Grier some time later on. So, it's tough to really say, but, just based off of, again, being a little bit of a football sicko who watches a lot of preseason and has watched a lot of Eagles preseason games, that'd be my I guess I'd call it an educated guess.
All right. I appreciate that educated guess. Thank you, Michael, for your question. We appreciate you joining in. Let's transition into some of the, I think, real positional battles. Not that I think the backup quarterback. Well, no, I don't think that's much of a positional battle, and we can talk about that at another time. But let's talk about some of the real legitimate positional battles that have been playing out throughout training camp, and that will continue to play out as we go through the preseason. Let's start with cornerback. The Eagles are still on the hunt for who is going to start on the outside opposite Darius Slay. That role was previously occupied by James Bradbury. Bradbury now has exclusively been taking his snaps at safety. I don't think we've seen him at all at cornerback or even in the slot. And those snaps have primarily been reserved for Isaiah Rodgers and Kelee Ringo. We have seen Quinyon Mitchell more so emerge as the front runner for the starting slot role. But recently, a lot of Rodgers with some Ringo, especially in the last 4 days. The Eagles had 4 consecutive practices leading into this preseason game. We saw a lot of Isaiah Rodgers. He seems to be pulling away a little bit more with this starting outside cornerback role. EJ, right now, if you had to pick one that you think is going to end up there for week 1, not necessarily who you think will end up there down the line, although you can certainly talk about that too, who do you think it would be?
It's a good question. At the beginning of training camp, when it's Kelee Ringo and Isaiah Rodgers at cornerback 2 opposite of Darius Slay, you kind of think, okay, we've seen this before with the Eagles with rookies. They want them to earn it. They want to start them on the third team or the second team. So it makes sense that Quinyon Mitchell would be behind those guys. But when we started seeing Quinyon Mitchell getting reps in the slot, that's when my eyebrows sort of went up, and I went, okay, they might be interested in trying to see where they could get him on the field if he doesn't beat out Isaiah Rodgers and Kelee Ringo for that spot. I think that's what we've seen happen. I think, like you said, Quinyon Mitchell will probably end up being a starting outside cornerback for the Eagles at some point. But honestly, their offseason moves the last few years have given them, it really was last offseason, have given them depth at outside cornerback. And Isaiah Rodgers, if you had to ask, if I had to answer who's going to be the starting outside cornerback opposite Darius Slay today, I would put most of my eggs in the Isaiah Rodgers basket at this point. I think Kelee Ringo still has an outside chance. I think he's an intriguing player. But I think Rodgers, it's like, he's a proven NFL cornerback. Obviously he had the year suspension and he's missed a lot of time, but I think the fact that he's come into training camp and earned, the early advantage at that spot really does tell you a lot about where he's at in the pecking order. I'd probably put it like 70% Isaiah Rodgers, and then maybe I'd give like Kelee Ringo like 20. I don't know, actually. I might be a little too strong there, because I do think there's still a chance that Quinyon Mitchell comes out here in the next 3 weeks, has an interception. Listen, it's not really something that Quinyon Mitchell hasn't done. In his one-on-one matchups against A.J. Brown, he's looked really good. Devontae Smith, he's struggled a little bit, but, he can join the club of every cornerback on the Eagles roster that has struggled against Devontae Smith this training camp. That doesn't really hold a lot of water right now. So I could see Quinyon still kind of making a late push for that spot going into the regular season. But if you had to ask me right now, based off what we've seen, I'd say Isaiah Rodgers has definitely the best chance of being that outside cornerback for week 1 in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Another position battle that has been playing out pretty extensively throughout the last several weeks, and certainly has been a lot of speculation, even in mandatory minicamp and OTAs, has been who is going to step in to the starting right guard role. Cam Jurgens, that was his role last season. With Jason Kelsey's retirement, Jurgens now moves to center and leaves this void at right guard on the offensive line. Naturally, we thought that, and we still continue to believe that Tyler Steen has a real chance and has been in the pole position, if you want to use an F1 term, a racing term. I won't pretend to know a lot about that, but I do know that Tyler Steen has a pretty good shot at the starting right guard job, and he has. However, he was sidelined for several practices with an ankle injury, and we saw Mekhi Becton take over in that spot. Now Mekhi Becton is a converted tackle who spent the last 3 seasons with the New York Jets, didn't really, latch on, struggled with some injuries, and now here he is, this 6'7", 363-pound man, now trying to play the right guard spot. And now that Steen is back in practice, he was not a limited participant in the most recent practice, and Mekhi Becton still held down that starting role with the rest of the starting offensive line at right guard. So certainly something to watch there. Again, EJ, if you had to pick a starter for week 1, who would you pick?
I'd go with Becton at this point. I think you can kind of see like Jeff Stoutland get excited when he talks about Mekhi Becton and, kind of the things he's able to do at the size that he's at. It's not to say that Jeff Stoutland hasn't been complimentary to Tyler Steen as well. I think Tyler Steen looks like a guard this year. Last year, I think he looked like a college tackle. It's a hard transition to make. I mean, guys make it, but I do think that there's, it's a learning curve to go from playing left tackle at Alabama and Vanderbilt before that to, right guard or left guard, in the NFL. So I do think Steen has definitely put on some weight and gotten stronger, as Jeff Stoutland has told us. But I just think being around the team long enough and hearing Jeff Stoutland talk about offensive linemen and what kind of, he values guys that are just like different, like kind of like what makes you unusual is what he would call it. And Mekhi Becton is very unusual, the way that the size that he is and the way that he can move at that position or at that size. Obviously it's a big transition for him too. I just talked about it for Steen. Becton, was exclusively a tackle in New York. He didn't even want to switch from the left side to the right side when he was with the Jets. I think, your career kind of taking the turn that it has kind of makes you a little bit more willing to position changes. So I think it's very telling that even though Steen is back in practice, he's with the twos right now. I think that they're going to let this Mekhi Becton experiment run its course. And I think it is kind of his job to lose at this point. I mean, I feel, kind of contradictory saying this because I wrote that it was Tyler Steen's job to lose going into training camp. And I think it's kind of flipped on its head at this point. So I think that's, if I'm going to watch cornerbacks during, when the Eagles defense is out there tonight, I'm going to be watching who's at right guard for, when the Eagles offense is out there. Obviously, we're going to want to see how the offense looks. We're going to want to see Jalen Hurts if he's out there. We're going to want to see a lot of things, but how Mekhi Becton fares in game action tonight is going to be really important. So yeah, I do. I think I think I'd have to go with Mekhi Becton. I might put him like 65%, 70% over Steen at this point. I know I'm giving you percentages for all these. I think, and I'm not going to soft pedal it like I did with Isaiah Rodgers. I'm not going to walk it back. I really do think it's probably 65%, 70% to Mekhi Becton.
Okay, well, the real question is, what happens to Tyler Steen's locker if he does not win the starting right guard job? Because we learned that Cam Jurgens moved into Jason Kelsey's old spot in the locker room. We learned that Tyler Steen moved next to Cam Jurgens. So what happens to Tyler Steen's locker if he does not win that spot? Does he stay there?
See, great minds think alike, Olivia, because when we found out that Tyler Steen had that locker, I started asking around to other reporters. I'm like, well, what are they going to do if he doesn't win the job? I think there is precedent for if a young player is supposed to be a starter, they get the locker in the 5 with the starting offensive line, and if they don't win the job, they still keep the locker. So I don't think they're going to pull Tyler Steen's stuff. They're not going to move all of his stuff over back with the backups. They're not going to do that to him. I think that Mekhi Becton's going to be kind of over there with the rest of the backups, but he'll know that that should be his locker, I think. So that would be my guess. I'm going to put that. I mean, we're going to keep rolling with these percentages, Olivia. I'm going to put that at like 90%. I think if Becton gets a starting job, he's staying in that locker. I think Steen keeps his locker for sure.
I'm writing all of these numbers down, EJ. If you are at all off, we're going to be having a conversation later. We've got a question here that dovetails very perfectly into our next talking point about the wide receiver battle that is ongoing of our esteemed colleague. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks so much. He says, who is wide receiver number 3? How positive should Eagles fans feel about the team's second tier receivers, like whoever is going to be filling in at the third receiver position and the backup tight end position? So I guess we can focus on the first part of this question. Who is contending for this third receiver role? When we heard Nick Sirianni speak at the very end of July 29th, he talked about the fact that the third receiver role, it is going to be a by committee role. And if you look at the Eagles roster, there is no one player who really stands out at this moment for that job. We can talk about some of the candidates that are going to get their opportunities, especially in the preseason, to fill in that role. And that would be Britton Covey, John Ross, EJ, you already mentioned, Johnny Wilson, even Anaya Smith, another draft pick from this season. When you look at the collection of receivers that are contending for this role, EJ, who is really starting to see their stock rise in camp and who might be slipping off too?
I think Covey has had a pretty good camp. I think he, honestly, I think like his development from return specialist to wide receiver, a wide receiver who can bring value to the group, I think has gotten to a point where you can expect him to contribute in some way, shape, or form. The Eagles will tell you that it's not going to be one player that's going to be wide receiver 3. But, to stop beating around the bush and answer the question, well, let me say, Johnny Wilson has definitely helped his stock the most. He looks like a wide receiver. I think that's what the Eagles were hoping and curious about. At his size, he really could play tight end, but the way he gets in and out of breaks, the way that he operates, he's a wide receiver, I would say. And an intriguing one at that. But Johnny Wilson we're talking about here. He's a 6th-round pick. I would answer this question, who wide receiver 3 is. I would say the mystery man right now. I would say there's going to be somebody between now and week 1 that the Eagles will bring in, whether it's on the waiver wire, whether it's a trade, maybe a James Bradbury trade. I feel like there's options for them. I mean, when I think it was Jeff, our colleague Jeff McClain, who asked Howie about the wide receiver 3 position and if it was something that he would look for outside help with. And he said, they're happy with the group, but they're going to evaluate them every single day. I think that is Howie Roseman they will make a move if there is a move to be made there. So I think if I had to, if we're going to stick with the percentages, I'd say it's about 60% chance that the wide receiver 3 is not currently on the roster. I think Johnny Wilson and Britton Covey are good, 5th, 6th options. I think Paris Campbell and John Ross fall in that category too. If they're your 4th or your 5th receiver, you're in pretty good shape. Those are guys who are kind of like horses for courses. You have styles, different type of styles for different matchups. But I think if you're looking for like a bona fide 3rd receiver, because that is an important position in a Kellen Moore offense that goes into 11 personnel a good amount with 3 receivers, I think you're probably talking about, like I said, a mystery man, somebody who we don't know about quite yet.
EJ, I feel like I have to ask you this. The Patriots released Juju Smith-Schuster today. Do you think Howie Roseman's light bulb or something up there went off in his head about maybe we should? He seems to like throwing a bone to some of these players with draft pedigree who maybe didn't live up to expectations up and down the roster. I mean, there have been plenty of those signings in the offseason. Could this be another opportunity?
Yeah, the draft pedigree is definitely an interesting point. I'll give you that. But I would say, the Patriots really need wide receivers. They were kind of rumored to be sniffing around the Brandon Ayuk situation. I would probably venture to guess that if Juju Smith-Schuster could not stay on that roster, it pretty much, I think it speaks very loudly about where he's at in his career. You can never say never. But yeah, I would say never. So.
There's the word. There's the verdict. The second part of this question too about the second tight end. The Eagles they lost Jack Stoll in the offseason, and by lost I mean they didn't re-sign him, so it was very much an active decision not to bring him back. But now they are left with Grant Calcaterra, Albert Okwuegbunam. They also brought in CJ Uzoma as well, an established veteran in the league, plus some additional depth players. When you look at the group that is there now, especially with Grant now having been in the Eagles offense for the last couple of seasons, kind of emerging a little bit more as a receiver, who do you like as the second string tight end behind Dallas Goedert?
Yeah, it's definitely Grant Calcaterra. He's had a really good camp. I feel like I've talked to Grant the last 2 or 3 seasons about his strides as a blocker, and that's going to be important as a number 2 tight end, being able to be an inline tight end and contribute in the running game. or honestly contributing in pass protection, against blitzes, which is something the Eagles need to iron out this summer. So I think that it's going to be a big job for him, but I do think that, based off of training camp, he's shown that he's ready for it. The third tight end spot is the one that I'm kind of interested in. I feel like there have been some guys like CJ Uzoma, I thought actually had a chance to really run away with that job. He hasn't looked great during training camp. So I think that is really where the question lies. I think Grant Calcaterra is pretty much, nailed on as the second tight end at this point in camp.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the third tight end spot, that is purely of interest to like you and me, and we're gonna have to make our 53-man roster.
Yeah.
They're relying on the third string tight end. I think they've got bigger issues. Anyway, so those are some of the key positional battles that are going on right now. Let's talk about some of the players that we are going to have our eye on in today's game that may not necessarily be like battling per se for a starting role, but just to have a role on the team, or maybe they are. Who knows? Let's talk about it. So EJ, if you had to pick one player in today's game that you are going to be zeroed in on, who would it be?
Yeah, I would say James Bradberry would be the pick for this section. I tried to pick somebody that we didn't talk about ad nauseum earlier. Obviously, we talked about the Tyler Steens, the Jalen Hurts, even the cornerback competition. But I think Bradberry is an interesting case because he is here playing for a roster spot or playing for a roster spot somewhere else. Whether or not it's with the Eagles or somewhere else. But I think again, like with C.J. Gardner-Johnson injured, it kind of does present opportunity for James Bradberry to show what would it look like if they needed him, at safety. It's a position that they're thin at. And I do think, listen, I know fans are pretty conflicted about James Bradberry at this point. He's obviously had some low moments here. He's had some high moments as well. But I do think when you look at him as a player, I think he can do the transition to safety. Vic Fangio talked about how difficult that transition is, but if you're looking for like a cornerback that you could move to safety, you look for somebody like James Bradberry, somebody who's smart, somebody who's a little bit bigger. I don't really buy this lack of physicality thing. I think, it's a different position. So, being able to come downhill as opposed to being asked to tackle on the perimeter. So I think that James Bradberry has some intrigue. I think that the Eagles are going to want him to show his value across the league in the case that they do want to trade him, or just try and figure out a solution to, or resolution to where he's at right now. Being paid outside cornerback money but not playing that position. So I think that that's one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch the next couple of weeks. If you had asked me a few months ago, I would have not guessed that James Bradberry would be here playing safety. So I definitely want to see what he looks like in game situations. And I think he could, again, earn a roster spot either here or somewhere else around the NFL.
Yeah, I don't think we were doing the whole percentages thing during minicamp and OTAs, but had I asked you to put a percentage on whether or not James Bradberry would even be on the roster in training camp, I don't think it would have been a very high percentage. Am I right?
It would have been even lower than my percentage chance of Juju Smith-Schuster being signed by the Eagles. And listen, they'll probably do it now. You can never discount it. But it would have been lower than that, I think.
Well, I look forward to next week's Gameday Central, and we will revisit this conversation once again, wherever Juju Smith-Schuster ends up. I am going to be keeping an eye on, in today's game, Nakobe Dean. We didn't talk about the inside linebacker competition in the last segment, but I do think that it is still an ongoing competition. That being said, I think we've really seen Devin White and Zach Bond get the kind of preferential starting inside linebacker, kind of first crack at playing with the starters in team drills throughout training camp. It really hasn't been much of a competition in that regard. We just haven't seen Nakobe Dean as much in that spot. And when he has been in that spot, or he has had an opportunity to make a play, we haven't always seen him make that play. And I think that was pretty evident in the Eagles open training camp practice at the Link last Thursday. There were a couple opportunities for him, especially in coverage. Kenny Gainwell had a touchdown with Nakobe Dean in coverage. We saw Kenny Gainwell just, running in the open field and Dean not being able to make the tackle. So I don't think that practice really boded well for him. And Fangio said as much after the fact. That's not to say that he is out of the running for the competition. And I think that a good performance in the preseason could certainly help his stock get back on the right track. So I'm eager to see what Nakobe Dean is able to do if he's able to make some plays. Really, I'm eager to see someone on the defense make some plays. We haven't seen a ton from this defense throughout training camp. I want to see a pick. I want to see a forced fumble. Someone do something crazy. That is also what I will be watching for throughout training camp. Awesome. Well, I think everybody, is there anything else, EJ, that you want to add before we wrap things up today?
Just want to remind everyone, sometimes you get false positives in these games, not to pour cold water on at the end here, but let's take everything in stride, whether good or bad. These things you need time, you need context, but that's all I got. Like I said, I'm excited to watch some football tonight.
I think that's a great reminder. It is something that I think we all forget. And, we live it every single year. We get super high on someone who doesn't pan out ultimately during the regular season. So everything with a grain of salt tonight, everybody. All right. That is going to do it for us on Game Day Central. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you're tuning in over on inquirer.com/Eagles Gameday throughout the game. We will be there. I know I will be there chatting with you, commenting with you, engaging with you. If you have any other more questions that we haven't answered on today's show, make sure you drop them over there, and I will do my best, and so will my colleagues, to get to some of those today.
That's right. And also, we have to shout out our colleague, Jeff McClain. He has a brand new season of Uncovering the Birds with Jeff McClain, dropping, pretty much, I don't know, it might be a weekly thing. But yeah, he's got a new one that just came out today. You got to make sure you go over to listen to it. He gives you lots of training camp updates, really stuff that you can't get anywhere else. So make sure to listen to Uncovering the Birds wherever you get your podcasts, and go to, or if you don't know where to get podcasts, you can go to inquirer.com/podcasts. Thank you guys for everything. We're excited to be back, and we'll be back next week.